In the red dust of Ouagadougou, where the Harmattan winds carry whispers of ancient kingdoms, a young captain's vision would shake the very foundations of colonial legacy. This is the story of 7 projects that made Europe tremble, not with fear of armies but with the terror of losing their grip on Africa's soul. The baobab tree outside Mama Fatima's compound had witnessed 3 generations of French colonial administrators. Its massive trunk, scarred by bullets from the independence wars, now cast shadows over a different kind of revolution. The old woman's weathered hands worked the shea butter as she spoke to her granddaughter Aminata, whose university education in France had filled her head with European dreams. "Ah, ma petite," Mama Fatima's voice carried the cadence of griots from centuries past. "You think the white man's schools taught you wisdom? Listen well, the ancestors speak of a young lion who will restore what was stolen." Aminata rolled her eyes, her French accented more betraying years in Paris. "Grand-mère, these are modern times. We need European investment, not more military coups." The old woman's laugh was like wind through dried leaves. "Investment? Child, they have been investing in our poverty for 70 years. But this Ibrahim, he reads the colonial contracts like the ancestors read the stars. 7 times he will strike at their heart, and 7 times they will feel the earth shake beneath their stolen thrones." The morning sun painted Ouagadougou's skyline gold when Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the Council of Ministers, his military fatigues a stark contrast to their tailored European suits. The room smelled of imported coffee and nervous sweat. "Gentlemen," his voice cut through the air like a ceremonial sword, "for 63 years France has been mining our gold and storing it in their vaults. Today we will take it back." Minister Sawadogo, his French education evident in every nervous gesture, cleared his throat. "Mon capitaine, the agreements with France were signed by dead men to benefit living thieves." Ibrahim's interruption carried the authority of ancestral judgment. "Our gold feeds French luxury while our children starve. This ends now." The order was simple in words, revolutionary in impact. All gold reserves would return to Burkina Faso soil within 90 days. French mining companies would operate under Burkinabe sovereignty or not at all. In the mining towns of the southwest, where the Senufo people had watched foreign companies strip their sacred mountains for decades, the news spread like wildfire. Old Cone, a traditional chief whose great-grandfather had fought the French colonial army, gathered his people under the ancient kapok tree. "The spirits of our ancestors dance tonight," he declared, his staff striking the earth with each word. The young captain speaks with the voice of Samori Touré himself. "Our gold returns to feed our children, not their palaces." But in the glass towers of Paris, panic rippled through the corridors of power. Finance Minister Dubois slammed his hand on the mahogany table that had once belonged to a colonial governor. "This insolent boy threatens our entire African strategy. Without Burkina's gold reserves, our economic influence across the Sahel crumbles." President Macron's advisor leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "Then we remind him what happens to African leaders who forget their place. Economic sanctions first, then we face a revolution that spreads across every former colony," Dubois interrupted. "This isn't just about gold, Minister. This is about the idea that they can govern themselves without us." The red earth of the military training ground near Kaya turned to mud under the boots of Russian instructors and Burkinabe soldiers. Captain Traoré watched his men learn tactics that had never been taught in French military academies, tactics designed to defend African soil, not export African resources. Colonel Petrov, his Slavic features hardened by years in Syria and Mali, addressed the assembled officers in accented French. "Your French trainers taught you to maintain order for their benefit. We teach you to defend sovereignty for your people's benefit." Among the trainees stood Lieutenant Cabaret, son of a farmer from the cotton regions. His father had watched French companies dictate cotton prices for 40 years, growing poorer each harvest. Now his son learned to operate Russian equipment that could protect their fields from foreign exploitation. "This weapon," Petrov explained, hefting an AK-74, "was made for liberation movements. It has freed more African nations than all the French promises combined." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. These weren't just military exercises, they were ceremonies of spiritual and tactical decolonization. The ancestors who had resisted French conquest with spears and stones would be proud to see their descendants equipped with tools of modern liberation. In Washington and London, intelligence reports painted alarming pictures. General Matthews briefed the Pentagon's Africa Command, "Traoré isn't just buying Russian weapons, he's buying Russian protection. If this spreads to other French colonies, NATO's entire Africa strategy collapses. But for the village women who had lost sons to French-sponsored terrorism in the northern regions, Russian trainers represented hope. Mama Sankara, who had buried 2 boys killed by jihadists funded through French intelligence networks, brought traditional kola nuts to bless the Russian camp. "These foreign brothers fight beside our sons," she declared in Moor, her words translated for the Russians. "The ancestors welcome all who defend the land with clean hearts." The spiritual dimension wasn't lost on Traoré. He understood that military alliances meant nothing without cultural legitimacy. Russian Orthodox icons appeared alongside traditional African protective amulets in the camps, not as replacement, but as reinforcement of the universal human desire for dignity and sovereignty. The French embassy in Ouagadougou had stood like a fortress of colonial power for decades, its walls higher than any mosque or school in the capital. Ambassador Laurent Dubois paced his air-conditioned office, his pressed shirts and polished shoes representing everything Traoré's revolution opposed. The ultimatum arrived at dawn, delivered by a teenage motorcycle courier whose confidence spoke volumes about the new Burkina Faso. Dubois read it with trembling hands. All French diplomatic and military personnel must leave Burkinabe territory within 72 hours. The age of French supervision of African affairs ends here. This is madness. Dubois shouted into his encrypted phone to Paris. "We have investments, contracts, strategic partnerships." "You have exploitation networks," came the calm reply from Captain Traoré, who had somehow accessed the call. "Your partnerships have impoverished my people for 3 generations. Your time in Africa is finished." Across the city, French citizens faced a choice: stay as equals under Burkinabe law or leave as representatives of a colonial past. Many of the teachers, doctors, and genuine development workers chose to stay, accepted by communities that distinguished between individual French people and the French state's colonial apparatus. But the departure of French military advisors and intelligence operatives created a power vacuum that revealed how deeply France had controlled Burkina Faso's decision-making. Documents left behind in hastily abandoned offices showed decades of election manipulation, economic sabotage of competitors, and coordination with terrorist groups to justify French military presence. In the northern town of Dori, where Fulani herders had watched French soldiers ignore terrorist attacks on cattle markets while protecting uranium mines, traditional leader Amadou Barry addressed his people. "The hyenas flee when the lions return. Today we see who truly protected us, not the French soldiers who watched our markets burn, but our own young captain who values Fulani cattle over French uranium." The emotional weight of the expulsion resonated through the diaspora. In Paris, Burkinabe students gathered outside the Sorbonne, singing traditional songs while burning French flags, not in hatred, but in celebration of dignity reclaimed. Aminata, Mama Fatima's granddaughter, stood among them, tears streaming down her face as she understood her grandmother's wisdom. "We thought they educated us out of love," she whispered to her friend Salif. "But they educated us to manage our own oppression." The conference hall in Bamako buzzed with languages that French colonizers had tried to divide: Bambara, Moor, Wolof, Fulfulde. Captain Traoré sat beside Mali's Colonel Goïta and Niger's General Tiani, their military uniforms representing not militarism but liberation from civilian politicians who had sold their nations to foreign interests. "Brothers," Traoré began, his words carrying the authority of Thomas Sankara's legacy, "they divided us with artificial borders to weaken us. Today we reunite not as their colonies, but as one people with shared ancestors and common enemies." The alliance of Sahel states wasn't just a political union, it was a spiritual restoration of pre-colonial trading networks and cultural connections. The Mande Empire, the Songhai Kingdom, the Mossi states, all had been artificially fragmented by European borders designed to prevent African unity. In the ancient trading city of Timbuktu, scholars who had preserved manuscripts through centuries of foreign rule welcomed the alliance as a return to intellectual sovereignty. Dr. Mahmoud Zuber, whose family had guarded Quranic texts since the 14th century, addressed the gathering. "These manuscripts prove our civilization existed before European civilization poisoned our continent. This alliance restores the university that made Timbuktu famous when Paris was still a village." The economic implications terrified European capitals. A unified Sahel controlling uranium from Niger, gold from Burkina Faso, and cotton from Mali could negotiate with China, Russia, and Turkey as equals rather than as desperate individual nations accepting colonial terms. French economic advisor Marie Petit warned President Macron's cabinet, if they coordinate their mineral exports, they could crash European industrial production. "We're not just losing 3 colonies, we're losing our economic model for all of Africa. But for the Tuareg traders who had watched arbitrary borders separate their families for a century, the alliance represented cultural healing. A.G. Muhammad, a traditional leader whose grandfather had led resistance against both French and British colonizers, blessed the alliance with words that echoed through centuries. The desert recognizes no European borders. Neither should its children. The ceremony concluding the alliance agreement took place at sunset on the banks of the Niger River, with traditional drums mixing rhythms from all three nations. As the leaders signed documents establishing shared currency, defense, and resource management, they weren't just creating a political entity, they were restoring the spiritual and cultural connections that had defined the region before European intervention. The delegation from Beijing arrived not in military uniforms but in business suits, their approach fundamentally different from their European predecessors. Ambassador Li Wei bowed respectfully before traditional chiefs, understanding that African politics required spiritual as well as economic legitimacy. "We come not as masters but as partners," Li addressed the Council of Traditional Chiefs in fluent French, then switched to carefully practiced more phrases that earned appreciative nods. China was also colonized, also humiliated by European powers. "We understand the value of sovereignty." The contrast with French behavior was stark. Where French officials had demanded exclusive rights and preferential treatment, Chinese negotiators offered technology transfer, infrastructure development, and profit-sharing arrangements that actually benefited Burkinabe communities. In the gold mining region of Essakane, traditional chief Naba Tigray watched Chinese engineers train local workers on advanced extraction techniques that had never been shared by French companies. "These Eastern brothers teach our children skills," he observed to his council. "The French only taught them to carry their equipment." But the partnership went deeper than economics. Chinese investment in solar power plants, water purification systems, and telecommunications infrastructure addressed development needs that decades of French aid had ignored. Villages that had never seen electricity suddenly had power grids, while communities without clean water received purification plants. The spiritual dimension wasn't ignored either. Chinese contractors consulted traditional priests before beginning construction projects, respecting sacred sites that French companies had routinely destroyed. When archaeological remains were discovered during a mining operation near Bobo de Alasso, Chinese engineers halted work until traditional authorities could perform appropriate ceremonies. European observers watched with growing alarm as China's approach proved far more effective than their own colonial methods. British intelligence analyst Sarah Thompson reported to the Foreign Office, "Chinese soft power in Burkina Faso is unprecedented. They're not just offering better economic terms, they're offering genuine respect for African culture and sovereignty." The psychological impact on ordinary Burkinabe was profound. Market women in Ouagadougou's Grand Marché discussed the changes with excitement that had been missing for decades. "These Chinese treat us like people, not like children," observed Mariam Ouedraogo, whose fabric stall now accepted Chinese yuan alongside West African francs. "They negotiate with us, not for us." The transformation extended to education. Chinese universities offered scholarships with no requirement to study European languages or adopt Western cultural values. Burkinabe students could learn engineering, medicine, and technology while maintaining their cultural identity, something French educational colonial policy had never allowed. The uranium mines in northern Burkina Faso had operated under French control since colonial times, their profits feeding nuclear power plants in Lyon and Marseille while local communities lived without electricity. The nationalization decree came at dawn, timed with traditional ceremonies honoring the earth spirits disturbed by decades of extraction. Colonel Traoré stood in the mining town of Tambao, addressing workers who had been underpaid by French company Arriva for generations. Behind him, the French flag was lowered for the final time, replaced by the red, white, and green of independent Burkina Faso. "Your labor has powered French cities while your own families lived in darkness," he declared, his voice carrying across the crowd of miners still covered in the dust of their night shift. "Today your uranium serves your nation first." The technical challenges were immense. French engineers had designed the extraction systems to require European expertise, creating dependency that extended far beyond simple mineral rights. But Russian and Chinese technical advisors, working alongside Burkinabe engineers educated in non-European universities, began the complex process of technological decolonization. Master miner Issa Compere, whose father had died in the mines under French management, translated the captain's words into Songhai for workers who understood better the language of their ancestors than the tongue of their former colonizers. "The spirits of our fathers smile today, he called out. The earth they died to dig finally feeds their children. In Paris, the panic was immediate and visceral. French nuclear program director Jean Dufour briefed President Macron personally. Without Burkina Faso's uranium, we face energy shortages within 18 months. Our entire nuclear deterrent depends on sustained African mineral access. But for the traditional authorities who had watched sacred mountains carved away to feed foreign power grids, nationalization represented spiritual justice. The chief of Gorom Gorom, whose ancestors had buried kings in hills now stripped bare by French mining, performed ceremonies to heal the wounded earth. The mountains carry our ancestors' bones, he explained to international journalists who couldn't understand why mining had spiritual dimensions. Every kilogram of uranium stolen was mixed with our blood. Now the Earth's power returns to serve the Earth's children. The nationalization wasn't just about government control. It represented community ownership of resources that traditional law had always considered collectively held. French colonial authorities had signed contracts with puppet governments, but those governments had never had traditional legitimacy to sell ancestral lands. Young geologist Fatoumata Sowadogo, educated at the University of Moscow rather than the Sorbonne, supervised the transition with pride that her French counterparts had never shown. We're not just taking back our uranium, she explained to her team of Burkinabe technicians. We're taking back our right to determine how our natural heritage serves our people's future. The site chosen for the African Liberation University carried profound symbolism. The exact location where French colonial authorities had built their first pacification fort in 1896. Where soldiers had once enforced European rule, students would now learn African-centered curricula free from colonial intellectual frameworks. Professor Aminata Zerbo, who had quit her position at the Sorbonne to return home, addressed the first graduating class in multiple languages: French for international understanding, English for global communication, Arabic for Islamic scholarship, but beginning and ending in more to center African linguistic identity. For too long, we learned about ourselves through European eyes, she declared, her academic robes blending Western graduation traditions with traditional Kent cloth patterns. Today we reclaim the right to teach our own history, develop our own technologies, and create our own future. The university's curriculum prioritized subjects ignored by colonial education: traditional medicine alongside modern healthcare, indigenous agricultural techniques alongside industrial farming, African philosophy alongside European thought. But this wasn't anti-intellectual, it was intellectually liberating. Students came from across the continent, many abandoning European universities where they had felt like academic tourists in their own history. Kwame Asante, a Ghanaian studying traditional architecture, explained his decision. At Oxford, they taught me African buildings were primitive. Here, I learned how our ancestors created sustainable cities that lasted centuries. The research initiatives particularly terrified European academic establishments. Traditional healers worked alongside biochemists to develop medicines from indigenous plants, threatening pharmaceutical companies that had been patenting African traditional knowledge for decades. Agricultural researchers combined indigenous drought-resistant crops with modern farming techniques, potentially revolutionizing food security across the continent. Most threatening was the university's political science department, which analyzed colonialism not as historical curiosity but as an ongoing system requiring active resistance. Students researched how colonial economic structures persisted through neo-colonial agreements, how European development aid maintained dependency, and how cultural colonialism shaped African self-perception. French academic Jean-Pierre Martineau complained to UNESCO, "This isn't education, it's anti-Western propaganda. They're teaching students to reject European values and knowledge systems." But Professor Zerbo's response captured the decolonial spirit. European values gave us slavery, colonialism, and ongoing exploitation. African values gave us Ubuntu, collective responsibility, and respect for nature. Let our students judge which system deserves their loyalty. The university's impact extended far beyond formal education. Evening classes taught literacy in indigenous languages to adults who had been denied education under colonial systems. Weekend workshops trained traditional leaders in modern governance techniques while respecting customary law. Community forums brought university researchers together with village experts to solve local problems through combined traditional and modern approaches. 6 months after the 7th project launched, European capitals faced a reality they had never imagined: Africa governing itself successfully without European oversight. Stock markets from London to Frankfurt fluctuated wildly as investors realized their African investments depended entirely on European political control rather than genuine economic value. In Brussels, EU Commissioner for African Affairs Michel Barnier briefed an emergency session. "Gentlemen, we face our greatest crisis since decolonization. If Traoré's model spreads across the continent, European economic influence collapses within a decade." The psychological impact on European self-perception was perhaps even more devastating than the economic consequences. For centuries, European identity had been built on the premise of civilizing and developing Africa. Traoré's success challenged the fundamental assumption that Africans needed European guidance to prosper. British historian Professor James Wellington published an editorial that captured European anxiety. "We told ourselves we stayed in Africa to help them develop. Traoré's Burkina Faso is developing faster without us than it ever did with us. What does that say about our entire relationship with the continent?" But in the villages around Ouagadougou, where electricity now reached communities that had waited 70 years for French promises of development, Mama Fatima gathered her grandchildren under the baobab tree as she had for decades. Now, however, her stories had new chapters. "See how the ancestors worked through the living," she told them, her aged voice carrying the satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled. "They told me 7 times he would strike and 7 times Europe would feel the earth shake beneath their feet." Aminata, no longer torn between her French education and African identity, translated her grandmother's words for her young cousin visiting from Paris. She says Captain Traoré isn't just changing Burkina Faso. He's proving that Africa never needed Europe to be great. We only needed Europe to stop blocking our greatness. The ripple effects were already spreading. Youth movements in Senegal demanded an end to French military bases. Congolese activists called for nationalization of mining operations. Even in Kenya and Tanzania, which had never been French colonies, student organizations praised the Ouagadougou model of complete economic decolonization. European intelligence services warned of coordinated revolutionary activity across the continent, but they misunderstood the nature of the movement. This wasn't a conspiracy organized from Burkina Faso. It was an awakening of Pan-African consciousness that had been suppressed but never eliminated. The spiritual dimension resonated powerfully across traditional African societies. From Dakar to Nairobi, traditional leaders performed ceremonies blessing the young lion of the Sahel, and calling on ancestral spirits to protect and guide him. Christianity and Islam, rather than conflicting with this spiritual support, often reinforced it through liberation theology that saw divine justice in African self-determination. 1 year later, Mama Fatima's compound had changed dramatically. Solar panels installed through Chinese partnership powered electric lights, while a well drilled by the new government provided clean water for the first time in her 93 years. But she still sat under the baobab tree in the evenings, telling stories to children who now attended schools taught in Moor as well as French. "The ancestors are smiling," she told her great-granddaughter, born just as Captain Traoré announced his 7 projects. "They see their great-grandchildren learning their own languages, controlling their own resources, and walking with dignity on their own land." The international media had largely moved on to other stories, but the transformation of Burkina Faso continued accelerating. Agricultural productivity increased as farmers used traditional techniques enhanced by modern technology rather than replaced by it. Health indicators improved as traditional medicine was integrated with modern healthcare rather than dismissed as superstition. Educational achievements soared as children learned in languages they understood rather than colonial tongues they struggled with. Most importantly, the psychological transformation was complete. Burkinabe children grew up assuming they could become engineers, doctors, and leaders without leaving their country or abandoning their culture. The colonial mentality that had taught Africans to see themselves as inferior to Europeans had been shattered completely. Captain Traoré, now President Traoré through popular acclaim rather than foreign endorsement, stood before the United Nations General Assembly to deliver a speech that would be remembered as the definitive statement of 21st-century African independence. "We did not expel Europe from Africa out of hatred," he declared to delegates representing both former colonial powers and former colonies. "We expelled European control from Africa out of love. Love for our children who deserve to inherit dignity, love for our ancestors who never surrendered their vision of freedom, and love for our continent which has always been capable of greatness when allowed to achieve it." The 7 projects had succeeded beyond their original scope. Gold sovereignty had been achieved, with Burkina Faso's national treasury stronger than it had been in decades. Russian military partnership had eliminated terrorist threats that French forces had mysteriously failed to address. French expulsion had ended political interference while maintaining beneficial relationships with individual French citizens who respected Burkinabe sovereignty. Regional federation had created economic leverage that individual nations could never achieve. Chinese partnership had delivered development that decades of European aid had promised but never provided. Uranium nationalization had ensured that Burkina Faso's natural resources served Burkinabe people first. The Liberation University had created intellectual independence that would last generations. But the greatest achievement was something European analysts still struggled to understand: the restoration of African confidence in African capability. For the first time in over a century, young Africans could look at their continent and see success, progress, and hope that wasn't dependent on European approval or assistance. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows from the baobab tree that had witnessed both colonial oppression and post-colonial liberation, Mama Fatima's voice carried one final prophecy: this is only the beginning. When Africa's children remember they are lions, the whole world will hear their roar. The old woman was right. From Cape Town to Cairo, from Lagos to Nairobi, young Africans were indeed beginning to roar. And in European capitals, the sound made powerful people very nervous indeed. The 7 projects that had shaken Europe to its core were ultimately about something much larger than politics or economics. They were about the fundamental human right to determine one's own destiny, to control one's own resources, and to define one's own identity. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had not just changed Burkina Faso. He had changed what the world believed was possible for Africa. And that, perhaps, was the greatest earthquake of all.